No one dares enter the Alpha King's chambers after dark, especially not when the most feared ruler in the realm is burning with a fever no healer can break. The entire castle fled from his suffering, leaving him to face the shadows alone. But Claire, a lowly kitchen orphan, pushed open the forbidden door anyway. She spent the long, terrifying night kneeling on the cold stone floor, gently pressing a wet cloth to his brow, thinking she was merely comforting a dying man. But as the first light of dawn crept into the room, his ragged breathing stopped. The fever broke. The most dangerous man in the kingdom slowly opened his dark eyes, and his massive hand clamped around her wrist.
In the deep autumn of Thornwick, no one dared approach the Alpha King's bedchamber after nightfall, not since the fever had taken hold on the third night after the ambush, burning through the last of the Iron Ruler's strength like a slow, unrelenting fire. The great hall lay silent, torches guttering in their sconces, and the servants whispered in corners that the king was dying, though no one said it aloud. Claire stood at the end of the corridor with a basin of cold water in her hands, her breath fogging in the chill air. She had been sent to deliver hot water to the guard room, but a turn had gone wrong, and now she found herself outside the one door in the entire castle that every servant was taught to avoid. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should turn back. She should leave the basin at the door and run. Then she heard it, a low, ragged cough from within, followed by a sound that made her chest tighten. A small, broken groan, like a man trying to hide how much pain he was in. Claire's grip on the basin tightened. She knew that sounds. She had made it herself. Many times. In the years since her parents died, when she had no one to hear her and nowhere to hide her grief. She pushed the door open before she could talk herself out of it. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle on the bedside table. The bed was vast, carved from dark oak, and in the center of it lay the Alpha King of Thornwick, William of House Ashford, a man whose name was spoken with fear and reverence from the northern passes to the southern plains. He looked smaller now somehow, diminished by the sweat that plastered his dark curls to his brow and the flush that burned across his cheekbones. His left eyebrow bore a pale scar, old and faded, and even in sleep his jaw was clenched, as if he were fighting something only he could see. Claire set the basin down on the floor with a soft clatter. She hesitated, then dipped a clean cloth into the cold water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently to his forehead. The effect was immediate. A shudder ran through him, and he let out a breath so long and deep it seemed to carry the weight of the fever with it. His eyes did not open, but the tension in his jaw eased, just a little. Claire's hand trembled as she held the cloth in place. She had never been this close to him before. She had seen him 3 times, always from a distance, always with a crowd of guards and courtiers around him, always with that expression of cool, unapproachable authority. She had never imagined him like this, vulnerable and still, a man instead of a king. She did not know how long she stayed. The candle burned down, and she replaced it with another from the drawer. She dipped the cloth again, wrung it out, pressed it to his brow, his cheeks, the hollow of his throat. The water in the basin grew warm, so she slipped out to refill it, moving as quietly as she could. And when she returned, he had turned his head on the pillow, as if searching for the cool touch that had been taken away. She stayed. The night deepened. The castle settled into its quiet, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the slow, even rhythm of his breathing, which grew steadier as the hours passed. Claire's knees ached from kneeling on the cold stone floor. Her fingers were pruned and numb, but she did not stop. Every time the cloth warmed against his skin, she dipped it again, wrung it out, and pressed it back to his brow, over and over until the motion became a kind of prayer. Near dawn, the fever finally broke. William's breathing eased into something deep and restful, and the flush receded from his cheeks, leaving his face pale but peaceful. Claire sat back on her heels, exhausted, and allowed herself a small, shaky smile. She had done it. She had kept him alive through the night. No one would ever know. And that was fine. She had not done it for thanks. She had done it because she could not bear to hear a man suffer alone, even if that man was the Alpha King of Thornwick. She leaned forward to press the cloth one last time, and her hand brushed against his. His fingers closed around hers, loose but unmistakable. Claire froze. His eyes were open, dark, heavy-lidded but open, and they were looking directly at her. In the dim candlelight, she could see the faint shadow of confusion in them, the slow process of a man waking from a fever dream and finding something he did not expect. He blinked once, twice. His gaze traveled from her face to the cloth in her hand, to the basin of water at her knee, and then back to her eyes. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, scraped raw by the fever, but there was no anger in it, only a kind of tired curiosity. Claire's throat closed. She had rehearsed 100 apologies in her head during the long night, but now that the moment had come, all the words scattered like dry leaves in the wind. She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally managed to whisper, "Claire, my name is Claire." He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly, his grip on her fingers loosened, and he let his hand fall back to the bed. "You're from the kitchen," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. You shouldn't be here." "I know." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I'll go." She pulled her hand back and began to rise, her legs trembling beneath her. But before she could stand, his voice stopped her. "The water, it's cold." She blinked. "Yes, Your Grace. Cold water brings the fever down." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those dark eyes. Then he said very softly, almost to himself, "No one has done this for me in a long time." Claire did not know what to say to that. She stood there frozen, the wet cloth still in her hand, dripping onto the stone floor. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, puzzled, as if she were a riddle he could not quite solve. "You should go," he said at last, "before someone finds you here and thinks the worst." "Yes, Your Grace." She dipped into a clumsy curtsy, turned, and hurried toward the Her hand was on the latch when his voice came again, low and rough. "Claire." She stopped, her heart pounding. "Thank you." She did not look back. She could not. She simply nodded, opened the door, and slipped out into the cold corridor, closing it softly behind her. Then she leaned against the wall, pressed her hand to her chest, and tried to remember how to breathe. The castle was just beginning to stir. Somewhere below, a maid was lighting the kitchen fire, and the smell of wood smoke drifted up through the stone. Claire made her way down the narrow servants' stairs, her legs still shaking, her mind a blur of images. The curve of his jaw, the weight of his fingers around hers, the way he had said her name, as if he were trying to remember it. When she reached the kitchen, Marta was already there, bent over the hearth with a poker in hand, her gray hair escaping from under her cap. The old woman looked up at the sound of footsteps and took one look at Claire's face. "Well, girl," she said, straightening up slowly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." Claire opened her mouth, closed it, and sat down heavily on a stool by the stake. She was too tired to lie, and too shaken to tell the truth, so she said nothing at all. Marta studied her for a moment, then shuffled over to the shelf, took down a small clay pot, and set it on the table. "You'll be needing something warm in you," she said, her voice gruff but kind. "Sweet tea with honey. It settles the stomach and the soul." Claire wrapped her hands around the mug Marta pressed into them, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. She did not drink. She just sat there, staring at the fire, replaying the night over and over in her head. The way he had looked at her, the way his hand had closed around hers, the way he had said thank you, as if the word were unfamiliar to him, as if he had not spoken it in years. "Claire," Marta's voice cut through her thoughts. "You listening to me?" "Yes, Marta." "Don't lie to an old woman. You've got that look, like you've been somewhere you shouldn't have been." She gave Claire a long, searching look. "Whatever it was, you keep it to yourself. You hear me? Some things in this castle are better left unspoken." Claire nodded, and Marta seemed satisfied. She turned back to the hearth, muttering something about young people and their secrets, and Claire sat there, in the warm, dim kitchen, the mug cradled in her hands, the taste of honey and tea on her tongue, and the memory of a king's eyes in her heart. She did not note it then, but the night was not over, not truly, because in his bedchamber William of House Ashford lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his hands still faintly cold from the touch of the wet cloth, and he was thinking about a pair of gray-green eyes like moss after rain, and a voice that had said, quiet and sure, "I'm sorry, I'll go." Only she hadn't gone. She had stayed all night, and he had felt for the first time in years that he was not alone. The morning light came gray and thin through the high windows of Thornwick Castle, the kind of light that promised rain before noon. William of House Ashford sat propped against the headboard of his bed, the fur coverlet pulled to his waist. And he was aware, with a clarity that surprised him, of two things at once: that his head no longer pounded with fever, and that the bowl of herbal broth on the table beside him was still faintly warm. He had not asked for it. He could not remember anyone bringing it. And yet there it sat, steam curling in a thin, patient ribbon, as if placed there by some quiet hand that had no intention of being noticed. He stared at the bowl for a long moment. Then he called for Edmund. The old steward entered with his usual measured tread, his keys clinking softly at his belt. And he stopped just inside the threshold, studying his king with a practiced eye. "You look better," Edmund said. "Not good, but better." "Flattery," William said dryly. "As always." He gestured at the bowl. "Who brought this?" Edmund's eyebrows rose a fraction. "I assumed it was the physician." "The physician left instructions, not broth. Someone made this. Someone carried it up those stairs before dawn." William's voice was quiet, but there was a weight in it that made Edmund's keys stop their faint clinking. "Last night, someone was in this room, a woman. She changed the cloths on my forehead all night. I thought at first I dreamed it." Edmund was silent for a moment. Then he said, "The girl from the kitchen." "Claire." "Claire?" William tested the name, turning it over like a stone found on a path. It was a plain name, honest, the kind of name that did not announce itself. "She was here all night?" "So I am told. The night guard saw her go in near midnight and leave just before dawn. She carried water in and out." Edmund paused. "She is the orphan who helps Marta in the kitchens. She has been here, let me think, nearly 2 years now. Quiet girl, keeps to herself." William looked at the bowl of broth again. The steam had thinned. "She will have ruined herself," he said slowly. "A woman, alone in the king's chamber at night. The rumors will be merciless." "The rumors have already started," Edmund admitted. "The kitchen girls talk. But Marta has put a stop to the worst of it. She told them the girl was fetching water for the physician, nothing more." "And the girl herself?" "She said nothing. She went back to work as if nothing had happened." William was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the gray light strengthened, and somewhere in the courtyard a dog barked twice, then fell silent. He thought about the gray-green eyes that had looked at him in the dimness of his chamber, the way she had flinched when he spoke, the way she had said quiet and sure, "I'm sorry, I'll go," and how she had not gone. "Send her a portion of the venison from tonight's table," William said at last, "and tell Marta it is for the girl with the gray eyes." Edmund's eyebrows rose higher. "My lord." "It is not a favor," William said, though something in his chest twisted at the lie. "A servant worked through the night for her king. It is fitting that she be fed well." Edmund studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "As you say, my lord." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "The physician wants to bleed you again this afternoon. Tell him I am bled enough." "That is what I expected you to say." "I will tell him you said it with your usual charm." And Edmund was gone, his keys clinking their woods. Looking down the corridor, in the kitchens, the morning passed in its usual rhythm of fire and flour and steam. Claire stood at the long wooden table, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands deep in a basin of cold water, scrubbing the last of the breakfast pots. The work was familiar, and she let it fill her mind, the way she had learned to let it fill her mind on the mornings after nights she wished to forget. She had not slept well. That was not surprising. She had expected not to sleep well. What surprised her was the thing that kept her awake. Not fear, not the memory of his fevered hand gripping hers, but the sound of his voice, rough with illness, asking her name, not ordering, asking. She scrubbed harder. "Child!" Marta's voice came from behind her, and Claire turned to find the old woman holding a small cloth bundle, steaming gently. "The steward sent this down for you, from his lordship's table." Claire's hands went still in the water. "For me?" "For the girl with the gray eyes," he said. Marta's mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. "You have been noticed, child. That is not always a good thing in this castle, but it is not always a bad one either." Claire dried her hands on her apron and took the bundle. Inside was a thick slice of venison, still warm, glistening with juices, and a small, round loaf of dark bread. It was more food than she usually saw in a week. She stared at it, and something in her chest tightened. "Eat it," Marta said firmly, "and stop looking at it like it might bite you. The king gave it to you. Eat it and be glad." Claire sat down on the bench and ate, slowly, savoring each bite. And as she ate, she thought about the king's hand on hers in the dark and the way he had said her name, and she wondered, not for the first time, what kind of man asked a servant her name in the middle of the night, and then sent her venison in the morning. She did not have an answer, but the question stayed with her, warm and persistent, long after the last bite was gone. That afternoon, as the light began to slope toward evening, Claire was sent to the storeroom to fetch a sack of dried beans. The storeroom was in the lower corridor, past the great hall, and as she walked back through the narrow stone passage, she heard a commotion near the kitchen door. A small, sharp cry, then the sound of a child sobbing. She quickened her pace. A boy of perhaps 9 years, one of the stable hand's sons, was sitting on the cobblestones just outside the kitchen, clutching his wrist and wailing. He had tripped on a loose stone and scraped his palm badly. Gravel was embedded in the raw red skin, and the boy was crying the way children cry when they are more frightened than hurt. A small crowd of kitchen girls had gathered, none of them quite sure what to do. Claire set down the sack of beans and knelt beside him. "Let me see," she said, her voice low and gentle. The boy sniffled and held out his hand. She turned it over carefully, studying the scrape with a practiced eye. "It is not as bad as it looks," she said. "But we should clean it, or it will fester." She tore a strip from the hem of her apron, dampened it in the water bucket by the door, and knelt there on the cold cobblestones, patiently picking out the bits of gravel while the boy whimpered and the kitchen girls watched in silence. She worked the way she did everything in the castle. Quietly, carefully, as if the task mattered more than anything else in the world at that moment. She did not see the tall figure that stopped in the shadow of the colonnade at the edge in the courtyard. She did not see the way his dark eyes rested on her, on the bent head with its simple cloth-wrapped braid, on the careful, gentle movements of her hands as she tended the child's scrape. She did not see him stand there for a long, still moment, watching her with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite something else. But William of House Ashford saw her, and for the second time in 2 days he felt something shift in his chest. A thing he had not expected and did not have a name for. He turned silently and walked away, his boots making no sound on the stone, and Claire, bent over the boy's hand, felt a prickle at the back of her neck, a sense of being watched. She looked up, scanning the courtyard. There was no one there, just the empty colonnade and the deep shadows gathering in its corners, and the gray light of an autumn afternoon settling over the stones. She finished bandaging the boy's hand, patted his shoulder, and sent him off with a piece of honey cake from Marta's store. Then she picked up the sack of beans and walked slowly back to the kitchen, and she found, to her own surprise, that her heart was beating a little faster than the task warranted. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that the empty colonnade was just empty, that the prickle on her neck had been nothing but the wind. But all through the rest of the afternoon, as she worked and scrubbed and carried, one thought kept circling in her mind, soft and stubborn as a moth at a candle. He was there, he was watching, and she did not know if that was a danger or a gift or the beginning of something she was not brave enough to name. The fever came back on the 3rd night after William rose from his sickbed, and it came back with a fury that made the fuck think some like a passing chill. He had been well enough to walk to the window that afternoon, to stand with his hand on the cold stone and look out at the gray autumn light. Edmund had brought him reports, and he had read them, and he had even signed one with a steady hand. But by evening his brow was hot to the touch again, and the old wound on his side had begun to throb with a dull, angry pulse that no poultice could quiet. The maester was summoned. He was a thin, tired man named Aldrich, and he had served the house Ashford for 30 years. He looked at the wound, and he frowned, and he said the words that no one in the great hall wanted to hear. "The flesh is not healing as it should. There is something in it that I cannot name." William lay in his great bed, his face turned toward the dark ceiling, and said nothing. He had never been a man who complained. Even as a boy, when his father had struck him for a mistake in the training yard, he had bitten his tongue and said nothing. Complaining was a luxury for people who had someone to complain to. He had learned that lesson early, and he had never unlearned it. By midnight, the castle was quiet. The guards stood at their posts at the far end of the hall, and the candles in the corridor had burned down to stubs. And in the kitchen, in the tiny room that she shared with two other serving girls, Claire lay awake on her narrow pallet, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind. She had heard the news. Of course she had. The whole castle had heard it by supper. The king's fever had returned, and the maester did not know why, and no one dared say what everyone was thinking. The girls in the kitchen had whispered about it over the washing basins. One of them, a girl named Nell, had said that perhaps the king was sent. Another had said that perhaps he was being punished for something. Claire had said nothing. She had just scrubbed the same pot 3 times, until Marta had gently taken it from her hands and told her to go to bed, but she could not sleep. She lay there for a long time, listening to the wind and to the slow, even breathing of the other girls, and then, very quietly, she sat up. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, she slipped her feet into her worn leather shoes, and she took the small clay basin that she kept beside her pallet, and she filled it with cold water from the barrel in the kitchen, and she carried it out into the dark corridor. Her heart was hammering. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself that the king did not need her, that he had maesters and guards and 100 people whose job it was to care for him. She told herself that she was just a kitchen girl, and that if she was caught near his chambers again, there would be consequences that she could not even begin to imagine, but her feet kept moving. The castle at night was a different place. The great hall, which by day echoed with the bustle of servants and the murmur of courtiers, was now a cavern of shadows. The torches had been bent low, and the stone walls seemed to lean in, as if they were listening. Claire moved through the corridors like a ghost, her footsteps soft on the cold flagstones, the clay basin clutched against her chest. She passed the guard post at the end of the king's hall. There were 2 guards there, and they looked at her with surprise, and one of them opened his mouth to speak. But Claire looked at him, and something in her face made him close it again. Perhaps it was the steadiness of her gaze. Perhaps it was the way she did not flinch or slow down. Perhaps it was simply that she looked like someone who was not going to be turned away. The guard stepped aside. Claire pushed open the heavy door to the king's chamber and slipped inside. The room was dark, lit only by a single candle on the table beside the bed. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow across the stones. And in the great bed, William lay motionless, his face turned toward the ceiling, his breath coming in short, labored gasps. Claire set the basin down on the table. She dipped a cloth into the cold water, wrung it out, and then she stood there for a long moment looking at him. She had never seen him like this. The king she had glimpsed across the courtyard was a figure of strength and authority, a man who seemed carved from the same stone as his castle. But this man, lying in the dark with his face flushed with fever and his brow beaded with sweat, looked small, looked mortal, looked for the first time since she had known of his existence, like someone who needed help. She pressed the wet cloth to his forehead. He flinched. His eyes did not open, but his jaw tightened, and a low sound escaped his throat, a sound that might have been pain or might have been surprise. Claire did not pull the cloth away. She held it there steady, until the heat of his skin began to seep into the cloth, and then she lifted it, dipped it again, and pressed it back. She did this for a long time. The candle burned down. The embers in the hearth shifted and settled. The wind picked up outside the window, and the cold crept in through the cracks in the stones. And Claire kept going. Dip, ring, press, lift, dip, ring, press, until her hands were numb and her knees ached from kneeling beside the bed. She did not think about what she was doing. She did not think about the danger, or the consequences, or the fact that she was a kitchen girl kneeling at the bedside of a king. She thought only about the heat of his skin, and the way his breathing eased a little when the cool cloth touched his brow, and the small, almost imperceptible relaxation of his shoulders when the fever let go of him for a few moments at a time. At some point she began to talk to him. Not in words exactly, she was not sure she could have formed a coherent sentence if her life depended on it, but in a low, steady murmur, the way Marta talked to the bread dough when it was rising, or the way the stable hands talked to the horses when they were frightened. She said things like, "It's all right," and "I'm here," and "You're not alone," and she did not know if he could hear her, and she did not care. At some point his hand moved. It was a small thing. A twitch of the fingers, a shift of the arm, as if he were reaching for something in his sleep, and then his hand found hers, the hand that was not holding the cloth, the hand that was resting on the edge of the bed, and he closed his fingers around it. Claire froze. His grip was not strong. It was the grip of a man who was half delirious, half asleep, barely aware of what he was doing, but it was warm and it was insistent, and it did not let go. She waited. She did not pull away. She sat there very still, with his hand wrapped around hers, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that she did not have a name for, something that was equal parts terror and tenderness. He said something. It was low and slurred, barely audible, half lost in the sound of the wind outside. Claire leaned closer, trying to make it out. "Don't go." That was what he said. She was almost certain of it. He said it again, his voice cracking like a boy's, and his fingers tightened around hers. "Don't go." Claire sat back and she looked at his face, and she saw that his brow had smoothed a little, that some of the tension had left his jaw. She did not know if he was talking to her, or to someone else, or to no one at all. She did not know if he would remember this in the morning, or if it would be lost in the fog of fever and exhaustion, but she knew what she was going to do. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, quietly. And she meant it. She stayed. The candle burned down to a stub and guttered out, and the room was lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. She stayed. She kept the cloth moving, dip, wring, press, lift, and she kept her other hand in his, and she kept murmuring the same quiet words over and over. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The night wore on. The wind died down, and the sky outside the window began to lighten, inch by inch, from black to gray. Claire's eyes were heavy, and her body ached from kneeling, and her hand had gone numb in his grip, and still she stayed. She must have dozed off. She did not mean to, but her head drooped and her eyes closed, and the next thing she knew, the room was lighter, and the hand around hers was no longer gripping. It was holding. She opened her eyes. William was looking at her. He was still pale, and there was still a sheen of sweat on his brow, but his eyes were clear, and watchful, and very, very still. He was looking at her, the way a man looks at a thing he does not quite understand, as if she were a book written in a language he had never seen. Claire's breath caught. She tried to pull her hand away, but his fingers tightened just slightly, and she stopped. He did not speak. He just looked at her, and she looked back, and the silence stretched between them like a thread. Then he said very quietly, "You came back." It was not a question. It was a statement, an observation, as if he had known she would come, as if he had been waiting for her. Claire swallowed. "Your fever came back," she said. Her voice came out hoarse, from the long night and the long silence. I brought water, to cool you down." He looked at the basin on the table, at the cloth in her other hand, still damp. He looked at her face, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the way her shoulders were hunched with exhaustion. He did not say, "Thank you." He did not say, "You should not have come." He just looked at her, and then he said, "I thought I dreamed you." Claire did not know what to say to that. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. William's thumb moved, a slow, absent stroke across the back of her hand. He did not seem to notice he was doing it. He was still looking at her, his gaze steady, his voice low. "You were here last night," he said. "The first night." "I thought I dreamed that too." Claire shook her head. "No," she said. "I was here." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You should not have come." It was the same words he had spoken to her in this room 2 days ago, when she had woken to find his hand on her shoulder. But the tone was different. It was not a dismissal. It was something closer to a warning aimed not at her, but at himself. Claire looked at him and she said, "You were burning up. There was no one else." "There are always others," he said. "There are always people whose job it is. You are not one of them." "I know," Claire said. "That's why I came." He stared at her, and then, slowly, something shifted in his face. A loosening, a softening, like frost. "Think you giving way to a faint, thin sun?" He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, but something in his eyes changed, and Claire felt it like a warmth spreading through her chest. He let go of her hand, gently, deliberately, as if he were setting down something fragile. "You should go," he said, "before the castle wakes." Claire nodded. She stood, and her knees almost buckled, and she had to steady herself against the table. She picked up the basin and the cloth, and she turned to go. But at the door, she paused. She looked back at him, at the man lying in the great bed with the gray morning light falling across his face, and she said, "If the fever comes back tonight." "It will not," he said. "But if it does," she said, "I will be here." He did not answer. She slipped out the door, and she closed it behind her, and she made her way back down the dark corridor with the empty basin in her hands, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the guards could hear it. She had almost reached the kitchen when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Edmund, the steward, standing in the shadows at the end of the corridor. He was holding a set of old keys in his hand, turning them over and over, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. He did not say anything. He just looked at her, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and he turned and walked away. Claire stood there for a long moment, her heart still pounding, and then she continued on to the kitchen, and she set the basin down, and she leaned against the table, and she let out a long, shaky breath. She had done it. She had gone to him again, and he had held her hand, and he had said, "I thought I dreamed you," and she had told him she would come back. She did not know what Think. Tend. She did not know where it was leading, but as she stood there in the gray morning light with the smell of bread rising in the air and the sound of the castle beginning to stir around her, Claire felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt that she was real, that she mattered, that she was a part of something, however small, however uncertain, and when she reached up and touched the old silver locket that hung beneath her clothes, warm against her skin, she made a wish. She did not say it out loud, but she felt it, clear and bright and unmistakable, glowing like a candle in the dark. She wished for him to live, and she thought, as she tucked the locket back beneath her collar and picked up her apron from the hook by the door, that if the fever came back again tonight, she would be there. She did not know if he wanted her there, but she knew she would go. The fever broke on the third morning. Claire knew it before she even opened her eyes, because the hand that had been burning against her wrist all night had gone cool. She lifted her head from the edge of the bed, stiff and aching, and found William of House Ashford looking at her. He was awake, truly awake, for the first time since she had begun slipping through his door in the dark. His eyes were clear, the gray blue of a winter sky after a storm, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. She had not prepared for this. She had prepared for fever, for delirium, for the terrible stillness of a man fighting for his life. She had not prepared for him to simply open his eyes and look at her as if he could see straight through to the bone. "You are still here," he said. His voice was rough from days of silence, but it held no confusion. He knew exactly who she was, think exactly what she had been doing. Claire opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to offer some excuse about having been passing by, about having heard him call out, about anything that might make her presence seem less deliberate, less desperate. None of it came out. She simply sat there, his hand still loose around her wrist, and said nothing. William's gaze dropped to where his fingers rested against her skin. He looked at it for a long moment, as if surprised to find that he had been holding her. Then, very slowly, he let go. "You should not have come," he said, but his voice was not hard. It was tired, and something else, something she could not name. Claire pulled her hand back and tucked it into her lap. "You were burning up," she said. "No one else would come near you, because no one else was fool enough to risk the fever. Then I was the fool." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if William of House Ashford were the sort of man who laughed. It came out as a low exhale, almost a sigh. "You are certainly that," he said. "What is your name, girl?" "Claire, Claire." He repeated it as if tasting it, testing its weight. "And you spent 2 nights sitting in the dark, pressing wet cloths to a stranger's brow because no one else would do it." It was not a question. She did not answer it. William closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they had softened almost imperceptibly. "You should go and rest now," he said. "You look like you have not slept in a week." "I slept," she said. "A little, in the chair. Then go and sleep in a bed, for once." He shifted, grimacing as the movement pulled at his bandaged side. "That is an order." Claire stirred, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She gathered the bowl of water and the cloth she hectors. "Leven found fine think in the midst it be using moving quietly, the way she had learned to move in a castle that did not belong to her." At the door she hesitated. "Your wound," she said, without turning around. "It is still seeping. The healer said it should be closing by now." Something flickered across William's face, a shadow, quickly suppressed. "Aldrich is a cautious man," he said. "He worries over nothing. Then he is the only one who worries over anything," Claire said. and slipped out the door before she could say anything else. She did not see the way William stared at the closed door after she left. She did not see him press a hand to his side, his jaw tightening, nor hear the low murmur he made to himself, a sound that might have been a curse or might have been a name. She was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. The kitchen was already awake when Claire made her way down the winding stone stairs. Marta was at the great hearth, stirring a pot of porridge with one hand and scolding a scullery boy with the other. The smell of bread and wood smoke wrapped around Claire like a familiar blanket, and for a moment she felt almost safe. Then Marta turned, took one look at her, and set down the ladle with a clatter. "Child," she said, her voice rising. "Child, you look like a ghost that forgot to lie down. Sit. Sit now before you fall." Claire did not argue. She sank onto the bench by the long wooden table, and Marta was already pressing a mug of hot tea into her hands before she had fully settled. "Drink," Marta ordered. "Then tell me why you were not in your bed last night." "Because I checked, and the bed was cold." Claire wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "I could not sleep," she said. "I took a walk." "A walk?" Marta's eyes narrowed. "At midnight, but in the cold, in a castle where the king lies wounded." "People walk at night," Claire said weakly. Marta made a sound that was half snort, half laugh. "People do not walk at night, child. They either sleep or they do things they do not want anyone to know about." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You have been going to see him, have you not?" "The king?" Claire's silence was answer enough. Marta studied her for a long moment, then let out a long breath and shook her head. "You were a fool," she said. "A kind fool, but a fool all the same. That man has a temper like a winter storm and a heart that has been frozen over for years." "I know," Claire said quietly. "And yet you went anyway." "Yes." Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and cupped Claire's face in her rough, flour-dusted hands. "Then you are exactly the kind of fool this cold place needs," she said. "Now eat. I will not have you fainting into the porridge." The morning passed in a blur of steam and chatter. Claire threw herself into her work, scrubbing pots, chopping vegetables, hauling water from the well, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of labor. But her mind kept drifting back to the bedchamber, to the look in William's eyes when he had said her name, to the way his hand had felt around her wrist. She was so lost in thought that she did not notice the commotion at the kitchen door until Marta elbowed her sharply in the ribs. "Claire," Marta hissed. "Claire, look up." Claire looked up. Edmund, the king's steward, stood in the doorway of the kitchen. He was a tall, stooped man with a face like weathered stone and a habit of carrying a ring of old keys at his belt, which he fiddled with when he was thinking. Today he was fiddling with them. The entire kitchen had think, you. Thinking them think you. Figary's face rapped, sempered out. He crested the flurry of Majid's steps, his boots echoing on the stone, and stopped in front of her. "The king," he said, in his dry, formal voice, "has instructed me to ensure that you receive proper rest and sustenance. He has also instructed me to inform you that he does not wish to see you at his bedside tonight." Claire's heart dropped. She had known it was coming. Of course she had known. He was the king. She was a kitchen girl. Whatever fragile thing had passed between them in the dark, it could not survive the light of day. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank him for his kindness." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Something flickered in his old eyes, curiosity perhaps, or something softer. "The king," he said, "is not known for his kindness." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "He is known for his orders, and he has ordered that a bowl of hot soup be sent to the kitchen at midday, to be given to a girl with gray-green eyes who has been working too hard." Claire's head snapped up. Edmund's expression did not change, but there was something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I do not know what you did to earn that, girl, but I have served William of House Ashford for 20 years, and I have never once seen him send soup to a kitchen maid." He turned to go, then paused. Whatever it was, keep doing it. He was gone. Before Claire could respond, leaving her standing in the middle of the kitchen with every pair of eyes in the room fixed on her. Marta was the first to speak. "Well," she said, her voice rich with delight. "Well, well, well." "Nothing happened," Claire said quickly. "He was ill. I helped him. That is all." "Of course it is, child." Marta's smile was wide and knowing. "That is why the King of Thornwick is sending you his own soup." "Because nothing happened?" The kitchen erupted into laughter, and Claire felt her face burn to the roots of her hair. She ducked her head and went back to scrubbing pots, but she could not stop the small, foolish warmth that had bloomed in her chest. The soup arrived at midday, as Edmund had promised. It was rich and fragrant, thick with barley and root vegetables, and a generous piece of meat, far more than a kitchen maid would ever be served. It came in a fine ceramic bowl, the kind reserved for the Lord's table, and it was still hot when the footman set it before her. Claire stared at it for a long time. Marta poured her a cup of ale and sat down across from her. "Eat," she said. "You cannot refuse a king's gift." "I am not refusing it," Claire said. I do not understand why he would do this." "Because you are a fool," Marta said fondly. "And he is a fool who has forgotten how to be kind. The two of you make a fine pair." Claire ate the soup. It was the best thing she had tasted in years, not because it was fine, but because someone had sent it to her. Someone had thought of her, in the middle of his own pain, and had sent her soup. It was a small thing. It was a tiny thing, in the great machinery of a kingdom, but to Claire it was everything. The days that followed were strange. William recovered quickly, as a man of his strength always did. Within a week he was walking the corridors again, though he favored his wounded side and refused the walking stick that Aldrich pressed upon him. The castle began to breathe again. The tension that had gripped every hall since his injury eased. And Strood. The servants moved with lighter steps. Claire saw him twice. The first time was in the great hall. During the evening meal, she was helping to clear the tables, keeping her head down, when William entered with his retinue. He did not look at her, did not seem to notice her at all. He walked to his chair at the head of the table and sat down, and the whole room shifted around him like water around a stone. Claire kept her eyes on the plate she was stacking and tried not to feel the small ache in her chest. The second time was 3 days later, in the garden. It was a cold, clear afternoon, the first frost of the season glittering on the grass. Claire had stolen a few minutes to sit on the stone bench by the old rose bush, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that Marta had pressed into them. The garden was empty, the way it always was at this hour, and she had let herself soak into the quiet. She heard the footsteps before she saw him, the firm, measured tread of a man who had spent his life walking through halls where everyone else stacked carefully. She looked up, and there he was. William stood at the edge of the path, dressed in a dark tunic that did nothing to hide the bandage beneath it. He looked better than he had in the sickbed. The color had returned to his face, and the shadows under his eyes had faded, but there was still a tightness around his mouth that spoke of pain. He had stopped when he saw her, as if he had not expected to find anyone here. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then William said, "You should not be sitting out here in the cold." Claire's grip tightened on her mug. "I was just finishing my tea," she said. "I will go inside." She started to rise, but he held up a hand, a small, almost unconscious gesture that stopped her in her think. Think? 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 Manny? Concern? William's jaw tightened, as if he regretted the word. "You have been working too hard," he said. "Edmund tells me you have been in the kitchen from dawn to dusk, every day." "Someone has to feed the castle," Claire said. "Many someones could feed the castle. You are not required to do it alone." "I like to work," she said quietly. "It keeps my mind from wandering." William looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that she could not read, something careful, almost hesitant, as if he were weighing words he did not know how to say. "I have not thanked you," he said at last, "for what you did, for the nights you sat with me." "You do not need to thank me," Claire said. "I would have done it for anyone." "Would you?" He tilted his head. "Would you have sat with anyone, pressing wet cloths to their brow, all through the night without being asked?" Claire opened her mouth to say yes. It was the safe answer, the modest answer, the answer that would keep her firmly in her place. but the words would not come out. William's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "I did not think so," he said. He turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving her sitting on the cold stone bench with her heart pounding and her tea gone cold in her hands. That evening, as Claire was helping Marta put away the last of the dishes, a young page appeared in the kitchen doorway. "The king requests," the page said, in the high, clear voice of a boy who had been rehearsing his message, "that the girl with the gray-green eyes attend him in his private study at once." The kitchen went silent. Marta looked at Claire. Claire looked at Marta. "Well," Marta said, "Bria, can sing the silence. It seems the king has more soup to send." The page led Claire through the winding corridors of the castle, past the great hall and the solar and the long gallery lined with portraits of kings long dead. They stopped at last before a heavy oak door, banded with iron and carved with the Ashford crest. The page knocked, waited for a low voice from within, and then pushed the door open. "Enter," the voice said. Claire stepped inside. William's study was a warm, wood-paneled room, lit by a crackling fire and a cluster of candles. The walls were lined with shelves of old books and rolled maps, and a great oak desk dominated the center of the room, covered in papers and letters and the detritus of rule. William sat behind the desk, his wounded side propped carefully against the chair, a half-empty goblet of wine at his elbow. He looked up as Claire entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Shut the door," he said. Claire shut it. William studied her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable in the firelight. Then he said, "Sit down, Claire. We need to talk." Claire stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tight in front of her apron. The fire crackled and popped, and the candles on the desk threw long, wavering shadows across the walls lined with old books and rolled maps. She had never been in this room before, had never imagined she would be a lad within a dozen paces of it. William gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She sat. The chair was worn leather, warm from the fire, and it swallowed her small frame. She kept her eyes on her hands, on the small burn scars across her knuckles, the roughened skin from years of scrubbing pots and hauling water. "I have not properly thanked you," he said. Her head snapped up. That was not what she had expected. She had expected questions, sharp ones, the kind that pinned a person like a butterfly to a board. She had expected to be asked what she had been doing outside his door, why she had dared to enter without permission, what she had hoped to gain. Instead, he was thanking her. "You do not need to thank me, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I do." He set down the goblet of wine and leaned forward slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his side. "You sat with me. You changed the cloth on my brow all night. You did not sleep, and you asked for nothing." Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I did not do it to be thanked." "Then why did you do it?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unfamiliar. She opened her mouth, closed it, and looked away. The truth was too large to fit into words, and she was not certain he would believe it even if she found them. "I do not like to see people suffer," she said at last. "It is not a complicated thing." William studied her for a long moment. The firelight caught the scar above his brow, and she saw, for the first time, how tired his eyes really were. Not the tiredness of a man who had been ill, but the tiredness of a man who had been alone for a very long time. "Where are you from, Claire?" She stiffened. It was a simple question, the kind anyone might ask a new servant, and yet her throat tightened around the answer. "North of here," she said carefully. "A small village. It was burned when I was young. I have been moving south ever since." "Burned by what?" "Raiders." She said the word flatly, the way one might describe weather. "They came at harvest time. They took everything. My mother, my father, the house, the fields, everything." "And you survived?" "I hid in—" Think. Think, root cellar. They did not think to look there." She paused, then added, almost to herself, "I stayed there for 2 days, until the smoke cleared. Then I walked. I kept walking until I found a road, and the road brought me here." William said nothing. He did not offer empty words of comfort, and she was grateful for that. She had heard enough hollow sympathies in her life to know they meant nothing. "Your parents?" he said after a long pause. "What did they do?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated. her fingers finding the outline of the small silver locket beneath her dress, hidden from sight. "My mother wove cloth," she said slowly. "My father, he kept the accounts for the village. He was a learned man. He taught me to read and write." "Then you are not a stranger to books." "No, my lord." William reached across the desk and picked up a thin, leather-gowned volume, holding it out to her. "Can you read this?" Claire took it with trembling hands. It was a book of old Thornwick chronicles written in a formal hand. She opened it to the first page and read aloud, her voice soft but steady. "In the 3rd year of the Ashford reign, the northern passes were sealed against the winter storms, and the people of the high valleys were brought down to the lowlands to wait out the cold." She looked up. William was watching her with an expression she could not name. "You read well," he said. "Better than many of my own scribes." The praise made her cheeks flush again. She closed the book and set it carefully back on the desk. "My father used to say that a person who can read can never be truly poor. He was wrong, of course, but he believed it. Believed it enough to teach his daughter." "Yes, my lord." There was a long silence. The fire settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Claire heard the wind outside, rattling the shutters, and it occurred to her that she had never been this warm in the winter before. The castle had so many fireplaces, so much wood, so much warmth, things that had never been wasted on her kind before. "I have lived in this castle for 20 years, William said quietly. "And in all that time, no one has ever done for me what you did that night, not my servants, not my counselors, not my kin." Claire did not know what to say to that. It seemed impossible. She had assumed a king would have people lining up to tend him. "Perhaps they did not dare," she offered. "Perhaps." He turned his goblet between his fingers, watching the dark wine catch the firelight. "Or perhaps they were all waiting to see which way the wind would blow before they committed themselves to my survival." She understood that. She had seen it in the kitchens, the way the servants watched the moods of their masters, the way a word spoken too loudly could cost a person their place. She had learned to read the weather of a room before she learned to read books. "People are afraid of you," she said, "so they keep their distance. It is easier to be afraid than to be disappointed." William looked at her sharply, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped, but then his expression softened just slightly and he let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had not been so quiet. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "I am," she admitted, "but I am more afraid of what happens to a person when no one stays, when everyone leaves." The words hummed between them, raw and bare. She had not meant to say them. They had slipped out like water through a cracked pot, and now she could not take them back. William set down his goblet. "I will think and send you away, Claire." "You cannot promise that," she said quietly. "You are the king. You do not know what will happen tomorrow. Or the day after. None of us do." "No," he agreed. "But I can promise you that as long as I draw breath, you will have a place in this castle. You will have a fire in winter and food on the table, and you will not have to sleep on a pile of straw in the corner of a kitchen wondering if you will be turned out in the morning." Her throat tightened. She blinked rapidly, looking down at her hands again so he would not see the wetness in her eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because you stayed when everyone else left," he said simply. "That is a rare thing, Claire, rarer than you know." She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying did not change anything, but something in her chest loosened. A knot she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. They sat in silence for a long while, the fire burning low between them. He did not ask her to leave, and she did not offer to go. The candles guttered and spat, and the wind picked up outside, and still they stayed, two people who would learn to be alone, discovering that it was possible to be alone together. At last William pushed back his chair and stood, moving carefully to favor his wounded side. He walked to the fireplace and added another log, then turned to face her. "You have been in this castle for 2 years," he said. "Is that what you want to do for the rest of your life? Scrub pots and haul water?" "It is honest work," she said. "It is not what you were made for." She looked up at him, startled. "How do you know what I was made for?" I know a woman who reads old chronicles for pleasure when she thinks no one is watching, he said. I know a woman who mends a child's torn sleeve without being asked, who leaves a bowl of warm broth outside a guard's post when he is sick and too proud to ask for help. I know a woman who pressed a wet cloth to a stranger's brow all night because she could not bear to see him suffer. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand. I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are, Claire, he said. I am only telling you that I see you, and I will not pretend I do not. The words settled over her like a blanket, unexpected and warm. She did not know what to do with them. She had spent so long trying to be invisible, trying to take up as little space as possible, that the idea of being seen, truly seen, felt like standing in a sudden shaft of sunlight after years in the dark. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded. It is late. You should rest. She rose, grateful for the excuse to move, to break the spell of the moment. She walked to the door, and her hand was on the latch when he spoke again. Claire? She turned. Whatever you were running from, he said quietly, you are safe here, you understand. She looked at him, standing there in the firelight, a king with a scar above his brow and a weariness in his eyes that she recognized because she carried it too. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she could stay somewhere long enough to put down roots, to stop looking over her shoulder. I understand, she said. She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had taken only a few steps when she heard voices coming from around the corner, two of the castle's ladies, their silk gowns whispering against the stone floor. The kitchen girl, they say, should think is in his chambers for hours. Alone. Scandalous. A man of his station. With an orphan from the scullery? They say he has taken a fancy to her. Sent her a bowl of soup from his own table, if you can believe it. The voices faded as the ladies turned down another corridor, their tittering laughter echoing off the stone. Claire stood frozen in the shadows, the warmth of the study draining out of her. The words wrapped around her chest and squeezed hard, and for a moment she could not breathe. She had known it would come. She had known that a kindness from a king would not go unnoticed, that there would be eyes watching and tongues wagging. She had known, and still she had let herself believe, just for an hour in that warm room, that she could have a place here. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. If she was not careful, she would lose everything: the fire in winter, the food on the table, the promise in his voice. And worse, she would drag him down with her. She made her way back to the servants' quarters with her head down, and she did not look at anyone, and she did not speak. But that night, before she crawled into her narrow bed, she took out the small, silver locket from beneath her dress and held it in her palm, tracing the worn engraving with her thumb. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. A person who can read can never be truly poor. She had never told anyone about the locket. She had never told anyone about her father, the learned man who kept accounts for a village that no longer existed. She had never told anyone that she, too, had once had a home, and she had never, not once, let herself believe that she could have one again. She clasped the locket shut and tucked it back beneath her dress, and she lay awake in the dark for a long, long time. The truth about William's wound came out on a gray morning, 9 days after he had last spoken to Claire in his study. The healer, an old man named Aldrich who had served the house of Ashford for 40 years, drew Edmund aside in the corridor outside the king's chambers. His hands were trembling. The wound has opened again, Aldrich said in a low voice, and there is something in it that should not be there. A poison, slow and patient. It has been there since the beginning, I think. It is why the fever would not break cleanly. Edmund's face went very still. Are you certain? I have seen such things before. In the wars to the south, it is not meant to kill quickly. It is meant to weaken, to make a man seem ill in his mind, in his judgment, until those around him begin to doubt him. Edmund said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked toward the heavy oak door of the king's chambers, and his jaw tightened. Who else knows of this? Only you and I and the king himself now. I have told him. And what did he say? Aldrich hesitated. He said, "Find out who wishes me to seem mad." Then he dismissed me. Edmund nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and drew out a ring of old keys, turning them over in his weathered fingers the way he always did when he was thinking. Then we shall find out, he said, quietly. But the poison in William's wound was not the only poison spreading through Thornwick Castle that autumn. It began as a whisper in the great hall, passed between noble ladies behind their embroidered fans. It grew in the guard room, where men spoke in low voices over their ale. It took root in the council chamber, where the older lords exchanged glances that said more than words. "The king has lost his judgment," they murmured. "A foreign kitchen girl, an orphan with no name, no family, no standing. They say he has given her leave to come and go from his study as she pleases. They say he cannot stop looking at her. Mark my words," said old Lord Barlow, who had served William's father and resented every change the son had made. "A woman who comes from nothing will drag a king down to nothing. It has happened before, it will happen again." Edmund heard these words. He reported them to William, who listened in silence, standing at the window of his study with his back to the room. "They are calling for her removal," Edmund said quietly. "They have written a letter. It is being passed among the older lords. They wish to present it to you formally." William did not turn around. "Let them write their letter. You cannot simply ignore this, sire. If they believe you are being what?" Edmund hesitated. "Being influenced. They say your judgment is clouded." William's shoulders stiffened. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful, as if he were choosing each word with great effort. "She has done nothing wrong," he said. "She has only been kind to me when no one else would come near. And now they wish to punish her for it." "Yes," Edmund said simply. "That is exactly what they wish." Claire did not know about the letter. She did not know about the poison, or the whispers in the great hall, or the cold looks that had begun to follow her in the corridors. All she knew was that the castle had become a colder place in the past few days. She kept her head down as she carried firewood through the kitchens. She spoke to no one except Marta. She no longer walked past the king's chambers, no longer lingered in the garden where he might see her. She had made a promise to herself in the dark of that night after the study. She would not be the reason he was brought low. The noble lady's laughter echoed in her memory. The way they had looked at her as if she were a stain on the floor. She would not drag him down. She would simply disappear, quietly, back into the shadows where she had always belonged. But disappearing was harder than she had hoped. It happened on the third day, in the great hall, in front of nearly everyone. William had come down to hear petitions, his first public appearance since the fever had broken. The hall was crowded. Claire was there because Marta had sent her to deliver a basket of bread to the kitchens at the far end, and she had been caught in the press of people when the king entered. She tried to slip away, but it was too late. She was standing near the front, near the lords, near the thin line of guards who parted as William walked through. He looked better than he had in weeks. His color had returned, and he moved with the old steady confidence that made men step back without thinking. But his eyes were tired, and there was a tightness around his mouth that Claire had learned to recognize. He did not look at her. He walked past her as if she were not there. Then Lord Barlow stepped forward, holding a rolled parchment in his hand, and the hall went very quiet. "Your Grace," the old lord said, his voice carrying to every corner, "we, your loyal counselors and lords of Thornwick, have taken the liberty of drafting a humble petition. We wish to address a matter that has caused great concern among your people." William stopped. He did not turn. "What matter?" Lord Barlow's eyes flickered toward Claire. She felt them like a cold finger on her skin. "The matter of certain influences," the old lord said carefully. "Oli, there is talk that your grace has been seen in the company of a woman of no standing. A servant, an orphan with no family, no name, no claim to your attention. And there is fear that such a woman, however well-meaning, may not have your best interests at heart." A murmur rippled through the hall. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. William turned slowly. His gaze swept the room, and when it landed on Claire, something in his face shifted. She could not read it. It was not anger, not exactly, but it was hard and cold, and it made her stomach drop. "Her?" he said, and his voice was flat. "You speak of the kitchen girl?" "Yes, your grace." William looked at Claire for a long, terrible moment. Then he said loud enough for the whole hall to hear, "The girl is nothing to me, a servant who overstepped her place. She was seen tending to me during my illness, and I allowed it out of weakness. That was a mistake." Claire felt the words land like a blow to her chest. "She is dismissed," William said. "She is to return to the kitchens and remain there. She is not to approach my chambers, my person, or my presence again. If she does, she will be turned out of the castle." He turned his back to her. Is that satisfactory to you, Lord Barlow? The old lord lowered his eyes. Yes, your grace. Then the matter is closed. William walked away without looking back. The crowd parted for him, and the great hall filled with whispers, and Claire stood frozen in the middle of it all, unable to move, unable to breathe. The noble ladies were watching her. Their eyes were full of satisfaction. She had been right. She had been right to be afraid. She had been right to think that she would only ever be a stain on his floor. She did not remember how she got back to the kitchens. She did not remember setting down the basket, or walking past Marta, or finding herself in the small, dark storeroom where the firewood was kept. She only remembered the tears coming, hot and silent, and the rough wood of the wall against her back as she slid down to sit on the cold stone floor. She had known it would happen. She had known it. She had told herself over and over that she was nothing, that she meant nothing, that she would only ever be a burden. And she had let herself believe, for one brief, foolish moment, that maybe, just maybe, he saw her as something more. But he did not. He had called her a mistake. He had called her overstepping. He had dismissed her in front of everyone, like a dog that had wandered into the great hall. She pressed her hands to her face and did not make a sound. The door creaked open. She did not look up. "Oh, child," came Marta's voice, soft and rough at the same time. "Oh, you poor thing." Marta lowered herself onto the floor beside Claire with a grunt of effort, and she put her broad arms around her, and she held her the way Claire's mother might have held her, if her mother had lived long enough to see her grow. "Don't you cry," Marta said fiercely. "Don't you give them that." "He meant it," Claire whispered into Marta's shoulder. "He meant it, Marta. He called me a mistake." "Listen to me," Marta said. She took Claire's face in her hands, forcing her to look up. "That man came to my kitchen 3 days ago. He asked me if you were eating. He asked me if you were warm. He asked me if anyone had been unkind to you. A king who rules this whole cold land, and he came to my kitchen to ask about you." Claire blinked, tears still running down her cheeks. What? "He asked about you, and then he made me promise not to tell you about," Mortax said. "And I kept that promise, because he asked. But now I am telling you because you need to hear it. That man is not pushing you away because he wants to. He is pushing you away because those old wolves in the great hall are circling, and he will not let them tear you apart to get to him." Claire stared at her. But he said what he had to say to protect you," Martax said firmly. "A man like that, he does not have the luxury of saying what he means. He has to say what keeps the people he cares about safe. And child, I have known that man since he was a boy with scraped knees, and I am telling you, he is not a man who comes to my kitchen to ask about just anyone." Claire's breath hitched. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe it so badly that it hurt. But the memory of his cold voice in the great hall was still too fresh. The look in his eyes, the way he had said mistake. "He told me to stay away," she whispered. "Then stay away," Martax said. "For now. But do not think for one moment that he means it, and do not stop being kind, child. That is the one thing they cannot take from you." The next morning, before the sun rose, Claire stood at the door of the king's chambers. She had not been able to sleep. She had lain awake all night, turning Marta's words over and over in her mind, and in the gray hour before dawn, she had made her way through the silent castle, carrying a small clay bowl wrapped in cloth. The bowl was still warm. She had brewed it herself, the way she had learned to brew it in the nights when he was burning with fever, the herb mixture that seemed to ease the worst of the ache. She set the bowl down on the stone floor outside his door. She did not knock. She did not call out. She simply left it there, like a gift left for a gloating household saint, and she turned and walked away. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around. She kept walking, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard his voice, low and rough with sleep. "Claire," she stopped. She did not turn. There was a long silence. Then he said, so quietly she almost did not hear it, "Thank you." She closed her eyes. She did not say anything. She could not. She walked the rest of the way down the corridor, and she did not look back. And she did not stop crying until she was back in the darkness of her own small room. William stood in the doorway of his chambers, holding the warm clay bowl in his hands. The steam rose from the liquid, carrying the familiar, bitter-sweet scent of the herbs she had used to ease his fever. He had not slept either. He had lain awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on her face when he had called her a mistake. It had been necessary. He knew it had been necessary. Lord Barlow and his faction had been waiting for any sign of weakness, and the only way to protect her was to make them believe she meant nothing. But it had cost him something. He had felt it leave him, that moment when her eyes had gone wide and hurt in the great hall. He had felt something in his chest crack, quietly, like ice breaking underfoot. He had not expected her to come back. He had not expected her to leave him this. He lifted the bowl to his lips and drank. The liquid was warm and bitter, and it tasted like the kind of care he had long since stopped believing in. When Edmund found him a few hours later, William was still standing in the same spot, the empty bowl still in his hands. "Sire?" Edmund said cautiously. "Are you well?" William looked up. His eyes were tired, but there, I think, was something in them that had not been there before, something hard and certain. "Find out who is behind the poison," he said quietly. "Find out who wants me to seem mad, and find out who has been feeding Lord Barlow his words." Edmund nodded. "It will be done, sire." William looked down at the empty bowl in his hands. "And Edmund," he said, "make sure the girl is safe. Make sure no one harms her. Make sure she wants for nothing." "I will, sire." William was silent for a long moment. Then he said almost to himself, "She brought me this, after what I said to her, after I called her a mistake in front of the whole hall." "She is a good woman, sire," Edmund said gently. "A good woman who has been hurt by the world more than most. She does not know how to stop caring for others even when it costs her everything." William nodded slowly. He set the empty bowl down on the table beside him, and when he spoke again, his voice was low and fierce. "Then I will make sure the world does not hurt her again," he said, "no matter what it costs me." The days after the king's cold words in the great hall settled over Thornwick like the first frost of the season. Claire kept her head down, her hands busy, her eyes on the floor. She scrubbed pots until her knuckles ached. She hauled water until her shoulders burned. She did everything she could to become invisible again, the way she had been before the fever, before the wet cloth, before she had ever learned what it felt like to be seen. But try as she might, she could not disappear. It started with the firewood. She came back to her small room above the kitchen one evening to find a neat stack of split logs by the hearth, more than she had ever been allotted in a single week. She frowned, counted them again. There were 12. She had never had 12 logs at once in her life. She asked Marta about it the next morning. Marta, who was kneading dough with the practiced rhythm of a woman who had done it for 40 years, did not look up. "Perhaps the woodcutter miscounted," she said. "Woodcutters do not miscount," Claire said. "Then perhaps it was a gift." "From whom?" Marta shrugged, but there was a knowing tilt to her mouth. "From someone who does not want you to freeze, child. That is all you need to know." Claire did not press. She had learned long ago that some kindnesses could not be traced and that chasing them down often made them disappear. So she burned the logs one by one and told herself not to wonder, but the wonder would not leave her. The bread came next. A loaf, warm and fresh, left on the sill of her window one gray afternoon. She had not ordered it. She had not asked for it. It simply appeared, wrapped in a clean cloth, still giving off the faint, sweet scent of Marta's oven. She picked it up, held it to her chest, and stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind outside. Then there was the cloak, a heavy woolen cloak, dark green, lined with soft sheepskin, draped over the back of her chair when she returned from the wash-house one evening. She touched it, and her fingers trembled. She had not owned a cloak this fine since she was a child, since the days when her father's house still stood, since before the world had taken everything from her. She did not wear it at first. It felt too much like a promise, and she had learned that promises were the most dangerous things of all. But the nights were growing colder, and the wind off the moors cut through her thin shawl like a blade. On the fourth night, she wrapped the cloak around her shoulders, buried her face, eyed Pumblin, to the fifth hole, and breathed in the faint scent of wood smoke and something else. Something she could not name. She did not sleep well that night, but she slept warm. It was Marta who finally told her. One evening, when they were alone in the kitchen, stirring the last pot of stew over the dying fire. "You know who it is, child," Marta said quietly. "You have known for days." Claire's hands stilled on the ladle. "I do not know anything." "You know," Marta said, "that there is only one man in this castle who can order 12 logs and a woolen cloak and a loaf of bread without a single question asked. You know that." Claire said nothing. Her throat was tight, and she was afraid that if she spoke, she would say something she could not take back. "He asked about you," Marta went on, her voice softer now. "3 days ago. He came down to the kitchens himself, which he never does. He asked if you were eating, if you were sleeping, if you were warm." Claire's hands tightened on the ladle. "Why would he do that? Why do you think?" "I do not know," Claire whispered. "I do not know anything about him. He is a king. I am no one." "He is a man," Marta said, "who has not slept properly in weeks. He is a man who was poisoned by someone he trusted, and who still managed to think of you, of your warmth, of your safety, before he thought of his own. That is the kind of man who does not ask for things, child. That is the kind of man who simply gives and hopes you do not notice." Claire closed her eyes. The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down her cheeks into the steam of the stew. She had cried so much in her life. She had cried when her mother died. She had cried when her father's house was taken. She had cried in the cold nights of her first winter at Thornwick, when she had cried, been 10 years old and alone in the world, with nothing but a thin blanket and a bruised heart. But she had never cried like this, not from gratitude, not from the terrible, aching tenderness of being cared for when she had forgotten what it felt like. She set down the ladle. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she said, very quietly, "I do not know how to be grateful without being foolish." Marta reached out and took her hand. "You do not have to be grateful, child. You just have to stay. That is all he wants. That is all he has ever wanted." The next night, Claire did not go straight back to her room after her chores were done. The moon was high and thin, a sliver of silver in the black sky, and the wind was sharp enough to sting her cheeks through the woolen cloak. She walked the long way around the courtyard, past the stables, past the armory, past the silent, sleeping barracks. She was not looking for anything. She was not expecting anything. She was just walking, letting the cold air clear her head, letting the quiet settle into her bones. She heard them before she saw them, 2 men, their voices slurred with drink, stumbling out of the shadows near the gatehouse. They were soldiers, off duty, their tunics loose and their swords hanging at careless angles. They saw her, and one of them laughed. "Well now," he said, stepping into her path. "What have we here?" Claire stopped. She clutched the cloak around her, but she did not run. She had learned that running only made them chase. "Out late, are you?" the other said, circling around her. "A little thing like you all alone in the dark?" "I am going to my room," Claire said, keeping her voice steady. "If you will let me pass." "And if we do not want to let you pass," the first one said, grinning. Clive felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had been in this situation before. Twice. 3 times in the years before Marta had taken her under her wing. She knew what could happen. She knew how fast a man could turn from smiling to cruel. She opened her mouth to speak, to bargain, to plead, but before she could get a word out, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision, and then the king was there. She did not see him approach. He was simply there, standing between her and the 2 soldiers, his broad shoulders blocking out the moonlight. He was not wearing his circlet or his formal robes. He was in a plain dark tunic, his sword belt slung low on his hips, his hair loose and unkempt. He looked like a man who had been walking the walls alone, watching the night, and had heard something he did not like. He did not draw his sword. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there and looked at the 2 soldiers, and the 2 soldiers went very, very pale. "Your Majesty," the first one stammered, stepping back. We did not know." "Go," William said. It was one word, quiet, flat. It carried more weight than a shouted order, more terror than a drawn blade. The 2 soldiers did not wait. They turned and fled into the darkness, their boots scrabbling on the cobblestones, their drunken laughter gone as if it had never been. William stood there for a moment, watching them go. Then he turned to Claire, and his eyes, dark and tired in the moonlight, found hers. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," Claire said. Her voice came out thin and breathless. "No, I am not hurt." "Good." He said nothing else. He stood there, a few paces away, not touching her, not reaching for her, just being there, solid and real and present. The wind blew between them, carrying the scent of woods, smoke and frost. Claire looked up at him. She had been afraid of him once. She had been afraid of his power, his coldness, the way he could make a room fall silent with a single glance. But standing here, in the dark, with the moon on his face and the memory of his voice saying one quiet word, she was not afraid anymore. "Thank you," she said softly. He shook his head. "You should not be walking alone at night. I know. There are men in this castle who are not worth the air they breathe. I know." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will have Edmund assign a guard to you, someone trustworthy, someone who will see you safely to your door." "Please do not," Claire said. He frowned. "Why not?" "Because," she said, and then she stopped. She did not know how to say it. She did not know how to tell him that she did not want a guard. She did not want protection. She did not want anything that would remind her of how small and helpless she was. She wanted something else. She wanted something she did not have the words for. "I can take care of myself," she said at last. "I have been doing it for a long time." "I know you have," William said. His voice was softer now, gentler. "But you do not have to anymore." Claire felt something crack open in her chest. She had built walls around herself for so long, walls of silence and self-reliance and the fierce, stubborn belief that she needed no one. And this man, this cold, distant king who had called her a mistake in front of the whole hall, was standing here in the moonlight, pulling down her walls with a handful of quiet words. "All right," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "All right." He nodded. He did not smile, but something in his face softened, just a fraction. "Come," he said. "I will walk you to your thing door." They walked through the sleeping castle in silence. William kept a step ahead of her, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his eyes scanning the shadows. He did not speak, and she did not try to make conversation. There was something peaceful about it, this wordless walk through the dark, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone. When they reached the door to her room above the kitchen, he stopped. He turned to face her, and in the dim light of the single torch burning in the corridor, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. The way his shoulders slumped just slightly, as if he was carrying a weight he was too proud to put down. "Claire," he said. It was the first time he had said her name. She had heard him call her the girl to Edmund, had heard the servants whisper it in the halls, but never like this. He said it like it was something precious, something he had been holding in his mouth for a long time. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The torchlight flickered between them, casting long shadows on the stone walls. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For a moment, she thought he was going to say something important, something that would change everything. But then, he shook his head, and the moment passed. "Stay safe," he said quietly. "And if you ever need anything, send word to Edmund. He will find me." "I will," Claire said. He turned to go. She watched him walk away, his broad back disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. And then, before she could stop herself, she said, "William." He stopped. He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders go rigid. "I waited for that," she said, her voice shaking. "What you did tonight, I waited for it. I did not know I was waiting, but I was." He was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, slowly, and looked at her. In the torchlight, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were not. They were dark and deep and full of something she could not name. "I am not good at this," he said at last. "I am not good at saying things." He took a step toward her, then stopped. "But I want you to know that I meant what I said. You do not have to take care of yourself anymore. Not alone. Not while I am here." Claire felt tears prick at her eyes again. She blinked them back, swallowed hard, and nodded. "Good night, William," she said. "Good night, Claire," he said. He turned and walked away, and she stood in the doorway watching him go, until the shadows swallowed him whole. Then she went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it, pressing her hand to her chest where her heart was still beating fast and loud. She did not know what this was. She did not know what it meant, but she knew that she was no longer afraid, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would not be leaving Thornwick. The news came at dawn, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat, and whose face was gray with exhaustion. He swayed in the saddle as he was helped into the courtyard, and the words he gasped sent a chill through every man who heard them. Lord Roderick had crossed the southern pass with 3,000 men. He was marching on Thornwick. By mid-morning, the castle was in an uproar. Messengers ran between the gates and the great hall. Servants whispered in corners, their faces pale, the kitchens fell silent. And even Marta, who could usually be counted on to fill any quiet with chatter, stood at the hearth with her hands folded, saying nothing. Claire heard it all in fragments. A scullery boy said the southern lord had caught William, a tyrant, a man led astray by witchcraft. A groom said Roderick had claimed he was coming to save the kingdom from an evil spell. She heard the word witch more than once, and each time it was spoken, she felt something cold settle in her chest. She knew who they meant. She kept her head down and her hands busy, scrubbing pots that were already clean, but her mind would not stay quiet. She thought of William's face in the moonlight, the way he had said her name. She thought of the way he had stood between her and those soldiers, his voice low and certain. And she thought of the 3,000 men marching toward the castle with swords in their hands and her name on their lips. It was past noon when Edmund found her in the scullery. He did not call her by name, only stood in the doorway until she looked up. His face, usually so carefully composed, was tight with something she could not read. "His Majesty requests your presence," he said, "in the library." Claire dried her hands on her apron. She did not ask why, she simply nodded and followed him. The library was warm despite the chill outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the heavy curtains had been drawn against the gray afternoon. William stood by the window, his back to her, one hand resting on the sill. He was not wearing his usual riding leathers. Instead, he wore a dark tunic, and she noticed with a small pang of worry that the line of his shoulders was not quite straight. He was favoring his wounded side. Edmund closed the door behind her and stayed outside. Claire and William were alone. "You asked for me, Your Majesty," she said quietly. He turned. His face was tired, more tired than she had ever seen it, and there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. He looked at her for a long think that only phonetically had it caused the room and stopped a few feet away. "Roderick is my cousin," he said. "My mother's sister's son. We grew up together. In a way, he was always the one who wanted more than he had." He paused. "He has wanted my crown for 20 years. Now he has found a reason to take it." Claire swallowed. "Because of me." William's jaw tightened. "Because of me," he corrected. "Because I let myself care about something. He saw it. He is using it." She felt the words land like stones in her chest. She wanted to apologize, to say she was sorry for being a weakness he could not afford, but the words would not come. Instead, she stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, and waited. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a thin silver chain. At the end of it hung a small silver lock, worn, smooth with age, its surface etched with a pattern she could not quite make out. He held it out to her. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me the day she died. She told me it would open something worth opening, one day. I have carried it for 20 years and never known what it was for." He looked at her. "I think it was for this." He pressed it into her palm. It was warm from his skin. "If the city falls," he said, "you will go through the postern gate, past the old mill, and follow the river south. Show this to the first patrol you meet. It will keep you safe." Claire looked down at the silver lock in her hand. It was heavier than it looked. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the worn edges press against her skin. "What about you?" she asked. "I am the king," he said quietly. "I cannot run." "Then, I am not running either." He looked at her, and for a moment something cracked in his expression. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if the distance between them were a line he did not dare cross. "Claire," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth than it had ever sounded before. "If you stay, they will use you. They will call you a witch, a schemer, a whore. They will tear you apart to get to me. Then I will stand beside you and let them try." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something raw in them, something she had never seen before. "You do not understand what you are asking," he said. "You do not understand what it would mean for me to lose you." She stepped forward, closing the distance he had not dared to close. She reached up and pressed the silver lock back into his hand, folding his fingers around it. "Then do not lose me," she said. "Keep it and come back to me." He looked down at his closed fist, then back at her face. The silence stretched between them, thick and warm, and she thought he might say something more. But instead he reached up very slowly and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. It was the lightest touch, barely there, and yet it sent a tremor through her whole body. "You will stay in the castle," he said. "You will stay close to Edmund, and when I ride out you will wait for me." He paused. "Can you do that?" She nodded. He let his hand fall, and something in his face softened, just a fraction. For a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man who was very tired and very afraid and very, very determined. "Good," he said. "Then I will come back." That evening the horns sounded from the watchtower. Claire stood at the window of her small room and watched the torches move across the castle walls as the gates were barred and the archers took their posts. The air was cold and smelled of smoke. Somewhere below she could hear the sound of men shouting orders, of horses being saddled, of steel being sharpened. She reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out the silver lock. She had not given it back after all. She had kept it, hidden against her heart, and she had not told him. She pressed it to her lips and closed her eyes. "Come back to me," she whispered to the empty room. "Please." Somewhere in the night, a dog barked, and the wind carried the faint, distant sound of drums. They were coming. The drums did not stop that night. They rolled across the valley like distant thunder, and by dawn the horizon was dark with banners. Claire stood at the window of her small room and watched them come. Thousands of them, moving slow and patient as a tide, the black and crimson standard of Lord Roderick snapping in the cold wind. She had never seen an army before. She had never seen so many men in one place, all moving with the same terrible purpose. She pressed her hand to her chest where the silver lock lay warm against her skin. She had not taken it off since the night he gave it to her. The castle gates were barred. The archers stood on the walls with their bows strung and their faces pale. And somewhere beyond the walls, at the head of the Thornwick forces, William sat on his war-horse with his sword drawn and his eyes fixed on the enemy. Edmund found her in the kitchens an hour before the first charge. He was older than she had ever seen him, his face gray with exhaustion, his hands trembling around a cup of cold tea. "You should be in the cellars," he said. "With the other women and children." Claire shook her head. She was kneading bread, her fingers moving by habit even as her mind was elsewhere. "I can't sit in a cellar while he's out there. The king ordered you to stay safe." "The king," Claire said quietly, "ordered me to wait for him." "That's not the same thing." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his cup and reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of old keys on a rusted iron ring. He turned them over in his palm one by one, as if reading a story in the metal. "There's a door behind the great hall," he said. "A servant's passage that leads to the postern gate. It's been locked for 40 years, and I have the key." He held up a single long key, dark with age. "If the walls fall, you go through that door, and you don't look back." Claire stopped kneading. She looked at the key, then at Edmund's tired, kind face. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because he asked me to." Edmund's voice was rough. "The king came to me. 'Before dawn,' he said. 'If anything happens to him, you're to be taken south, to the Ashford lands. There's a family there who'll take you in.'" Claire's hands went still on the dern. The Ashford lands. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. Not since she was a child. Not since the night her father had pressed a silver lock into her hand and told her to run and never look back. She looked down at the bread, at her own flour-dusted fingers, at the small white scars from 100 kitchen burns. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The horns sounded then, a long, low note that seemed to shake the very stones of the castle. Edmund's face went pale and he gripped the keys so hard the metal clinked. "That's the charge," he said. "God preserve him." Claire left the kitchen without another word. She did not go to the cellars. She went up the narrow stone stairs that led to the battlements, her skirts bunched in her fists, her breath coming fast and sharp. The wind on the wall was brutal, cold enough to cut. He pressed herself against the parapet and looked down. The valley below was a chaos of steel and movement. The two armies had met at the ford, and the fighting was thick and terrible, a churning mass of men and horses and flashing blades. She could not see William. She could only see the banners, the Black Wolf of Thornwick and the Crimson Serpent of Roderick, clashing again and again like two beasts locked in a death grip. An arrow hissed past her head and clattered against the stones. She ducked, heart pounding. A soldier grabbed her arm, shouting something she could not hear over the din, trying to pull her back down the stairs. She shook him off. She could not say why. She only knew that somewhere down there in that churning chaos of steel and blood was a man who had given her a silver lock and told her to wait for him, and she could not bear to wait alone. The battle raged for hours. The sun moved across the sky, pale and indifferent, and still the fighting did not stop. Claire stayed on the wall, pressed into a corner of the parapet, watching. Her hands were raw from gripping the cold stone. Her throat was dry. She had stopped praying, not because she had stopped believing, but because she could not find the words. And then she saw him. He broke free of the melee at the head of a small band of riders, cutting toward the enemy's standard. His horse was lathered and bleeding, and his sword arm moved like it belonged to a younger man, a man who had never been poisoned, a man who had never spent 3 nights burning with fever while a kitchen girl pressed wet cloths to his brow. But she knew. She saw the way he favored his left side, the way his shoulders tensed when he swung. The wound was open. He was bleeding, and he was still fighting. "William," she whispered, and the name was torn from her lips by the wind. She did not remember deciding to move. One moment she was pressed against the parapet, and the next she was running down the stairs, through the courtyard, toward the postern gate where a handful of soldiers were reinforcing the barricade. She did not go through the gate. She grabbed a shield from a fallen man, a battered wooden thing splintered at the edges, and she ran out into the open. The world became noise. Arrows whistled past her. Men screamed. Horses shrieked. She ran low, the shield held over her head, her heart slamming against her ribs. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to get to him. She found him at the base of the low hill where Roderick's standard flew. He had dismounted, his horse down and dying beside him, and he was fighting on foot back to the hill, surrounded by 3 men in crimson. His sword moved in wide, desperate arcs, and she could see the dark stain spreading across his tunic. She screamed his name. He turned. For one terrible, endless moment their eyes met across the chaos of the battlefield, his dark and exhausted, hers wild with fear, and then one of the crimson soldiers lunged, and William staggered, and Claire was moving before she could think. She threw herself between them, the battered shield raised. The sword came down, and the impact jarred through her arms, through her teeth, through her whole body. She did not fall. She held the shield up, her knees buckling, her breath a sob in her throat. The soldier stared at her, startled. A woman, on a battlefield, with a broken shield and a face streaked with tears and dirt. William's sword took him in the chest before he could recover. The other 2 fled. The hill fell quiet, save for the distant roar of the battle steam. Think, feeling below. William stood over her, breathing hard, his sword dripping, his face ashen beneath the grime. "Claire," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. "What in God's name are you doing here?" She lowered the shield. Her arms were shaking. She could not feel her legs. "I told you," she said, her voice cracking. "I wasn't going to wait alone." He stared at her. The wind tore at his hair, and she could see the dark blood soaking through his tunic, spreading from the old wound. He swayed, and she reached out and caught his arm. "You're bleeding," she said. "You're bleeding, William." He looked down at the wound, then back at her. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Something shifted in his face. Something she had never seen before, a crack in the iron mask, a glimpse of the man beneath the king. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a shout rang out from the ridge above them. Roderick's standard was falling, the Thornwick riders had broken through, and the Crimson Serpent was toppling, and the enemy was breaking. The battle was over. They found Lord Roderick in the wreckage of his command tent, his leg pinned beneath his fallen horse, his sword still in his hand. He looked up at William with a hatred that had festered for 20 years. You always thought you were the better man, Roderick spat. You and your precious honor. But you're not. You're just the son of a woman who trusted the wrong people, and you'll die the same way. William looked at him for a long moment. His wound was still bleeding, and his face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his voice was steady when he spoke. My mother trusted you once, he said. You repaid her with poison and lies. But I am not my mother, Roderick, and I will not make her mistake. He turned away. He did not watch as Roderick was bound and dragged away. He did not watch as the physicians swarmed forward to tend his own wound. He only walked, slowly and painfully, to where Claire stood at the edge of the ruined camp, still holding the splintered shield. She looked at him. He looked at her. The battle was over, and the world was suddenly impossibly quiet. Why did you come for me? He asked. His voice was rough, raw. You could have died. I know, she said. I came anyway. But why? She did not answer at once. She reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out the silver lock. It was warm from her skin, worn smooth from a lifetime of being held. You gave me this, she said. You told me it would open what was worth opening. You trusted me with something that mattered to you. She turned the lock over in her fingers. So I wanted to show you something I've never shown anyone. She pressed the catch. The lock opened with a soft click, and inside, nestled in the worn silver, was a small engraved crest. A stag beneath the crown, the mark of the Ashford family of the southern provinces. William's breath caught. He stared at the crest, then at her face, and she saw the understanding dawn in his eyes. Ashford, he said. The southern house that fell 20 years ago. The one that was betrayed from within. He looked at her, and his voice dropped. You're not a kitchen girl. I was. For a long time, Claire said quietly. I am. But I wasn't always. My father was Lord Ashford. He trusted a man who sold him to his enemies, and we lost everything. A loyal servant smuggled me north and left me at the gates of this castle. I've been hiding here ever since. She looked down at the lock in her hands. I've never told anyone. I was afraid. Afraid if anyone knew who I really was, they'd use it, or they'd cast me out, or they'd sell me the way my father was sold. Claire. His voice was gentle. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she could not read. Something soft, something raw, something that made her chest ache. You trusted me with your name, he said. Your true name, your family, your fear. He reached out and took her hand, the one that held the lock, and closed his fingers around it. Do you know what that means? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. It means you trust me, he said, more than you've trusted anyone in 20 years, and He stopped, swallowed, and she saw the sheen of moisture in his eyes. I have been waiting my whole life for someone to trust me like this, and I did not know it until this moment. He opened her fingers and looked at the silver lock, at the Ashford crest, at the small, worn piece of her past. Then he pressed her hand closed around it and pushed it gently back toward her chest. Keep it, he said. It belongs to you, it always has. But I thought, she faltered, I thought you wanted me to keep it as a promise, as something between us. He smiled then, a real smile, tired and true, the first she had ever seen on his face. That lock is yours, Claire. It was always meant to be yours. What I want between us is not a piece of silver. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a smudge of dirt. What I want between us is this. You trusting me trusting you. No locks, no keys, no secrets. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a small, wet, broken sound, and stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, careful to avoid the wound. I love you, she said into his tunic, her voice muffled, but clear. I think I've loved you since the night you woke up and asked me who I was. And I was so afraid you'd send me away. His arms came around her, slow and careful, as if she were something precious and fragile. She felt his chin rest on the top of her head. I woke up, he said quietly, and the first thing I saw was a girl who had stayed all night to keep me alive. And I thought, if there is anyone in this world I can trust, it is her. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, and she saw that the moisture in his eyes had spilled over, tracing a clean line through the grime on his cheek. I love you, he said. I love you, Claire of Ashford, and I am madly letting you go. She smiled at him, tear-streaked and exhausted and happier than she had ever been. Behind them, the sun was rising over the valley, gilding the ruined battlefield in pale gold light. The drums had stopped, the wind had died, and somewhere in the distance the bells of Thornwick began to ring. The winter that had gripped Thornwick loosened its hold slowly, the way an old man releases a fist he has clenched for too long. The snow melted from the battlements in gray rivulets, and the first green shoots pushed through the mud of the castle gardens, tentative and brave. Claire noticed them on a morning when the air still smelled of smoke and rain. She had taken to walking the garden paths before dawn again, the way she used to, when she had been nobody, and had wanted it that way. Now she was somebody. She was not yet sure who, and the garden felt different under her feet. On the fourth morning after the battle, she found William sitting on the low stone wall by the herb beds, wrapped in a heavy cloak, watching the eastern sky turn pale. He looked thinner than she remembered, and older, and something in her chest tightened at the sight. "You should be in bed," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I was in bed," he said. "I got bored. Boredom is not a wound." "No, but it is a very good reason to get up." She sat down next to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The silence between them was easy now, the way it had been in the study that night, when they had sat on opposite sides of the fire and said nothing and meant everything. "I used to come here before dawn," she said, "before I knew your name, before you knew mine. I would sit in the garden and pretend I had somewhere else to be. And now," she looked down at her hands. The small burn scars were still there, faded and familiar. "Now I think I am where I am supposed to be." He did not answer, but she felt his hand find hers on the cold stone, his fingers wrapping around hers with a gentleness that belied the strength she had seen him wield. They sat like that until the sun cleared the tree line and the bells of Thornwick rang for morning prayers. The days that followed were quiet, and in the quiet, things began to heal. Edmund, who had spent the whole war looking like a man who had swallowed a live eel, finally relaxed enough to resume his favorite occupation, complaining about the state of the castle. He stood in the great hall one afternoon, surveying the soot-stained tapestries and the cracked flagstones, and shook his head with the weary authority of a man who had seen too many battles and too few competent masons. "War," he said grimly, "is very hard on the drapery." Claire, who was helping Marta carry a basket of linens across the hall, laughed despite herself. It was the first time she had laughed properly in weeks, and the sound surprised her. Edmund turned to look at her and being a moment his stern face softened. He reached into his pocket and brought out his old key ring, the one he was always fiddling with. He held it up so the light caught the tarnished brass. "Do you know what these are, girl?" he asked. "You've told me 3 times, Claire said. "Keys to every old door in the castle. Every door I have ever locked and every door I have ever opened." He jingled the keys thoughtfully. "I have been the one to close doors around here for 30 years. It takes a long time to learn which ones are worth opening again." He looked at her, then at the direction of the king's chambers, and then back at her. He did not say anything else, but he did not need to. He pocketed the keys and walked away, muttering something about the drapery. Marta watched him go, then turned to Claire with a knowing look. "That old crow likes you," she said. "He does not like anybody. He likes you," Claire said. "He tolerates me. There is a difference." Marta hoisted her basket and gave Claire a small, warm smile. "You have a home here now, child. Do not go looking for it elsewhere." Claire opened her mouth to answer, but Marta was already bustling off toward the kitchens, her voice trailing behind her. "Come along. I am making honey cakes, and you are going to eat 3 of them whether you like it or not." William's recovery was slow, and Claire found herself slipping into a rhythm she had not expected. The caretaker had become the one who was cared for, in small and quiet ways. He did not hover, did not make speeches. He simply made sure she was never cold, never hungry, never alone unless she chose to be. She found a dry flower pressed between the pages of a book in his study one evening. A sprig of lavender she had tucked there weeks ago, on a whim when she had blinked dusting the shelves. She held it up and he looked at it and then at her. "You kept it," she said. "I did not know it was there," he said, "but I am glad it is." She put it back between the pages, carefully, and closed the book. "It is a good book," she said. "It is about the old wars. I have read it 10 times. "Then it is a very good book," he smiled. A rare and fleeting thing, and she decided she would collect those the way she collected dry flowers. The afternoon the last of the snow melted from the north wall, William came to find her in the garden. She was on her knees by the herb beds, her sleeves rolled up, her hands black with soil, planting the seedlings Marta had bullied out of the kitchen gardener. She heard his footsteps on the path and she did not turn around. She had learned the sound of his walk by now, the slight drag of his left foot, the way he favored his wounded shoulder. "The gardener is going to be very cross with you," he said, stopping a few paces behind her. "The gardener gave me these seedlings himself," she said. "He is not cross, he is grateful for the help." "I see." There was a pause. "I told Edmund to have the room in the east tower cleaned out." Claire's hands stilled in the soil. "What room?" "The one with the windows facing the garden. The one you said you liked, when you were dusting the curtains that one afternoon." She remembered. She had mentioned it in passing, without thinking, on a day when she had been scrubbing the floors in the corridor outside. She had not expected him to remember. She had not expected anyone to remember. She turned to look at him. He was standing with his weight shifted off his bad leg, his cloak pulled tight against the spring wind, and he looked utterly out of place among the seedlings in the wet heat. Faint cough. He also looked, she thought, more nervous than she had ever seen him. "I thought you might like to live there," he said, "if you want to stay." "Stay," she repeated. "In the castle, in Thornwick." He cleared his throat. "With me." She stood up slowly, brushing the soil off her hands. Her heart was beating very fast, and she could feel the warmth behind her ribs, spreading through her chest like the first heat of spring. "I have been staying for weeks," she said. "I thought you knew. I wanted to be sure." She walked toward him, stopping when she was close enough to see the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the scar through his eyebrow, the exhaustion that still lingered at the corners of his eyes. "I am not going anywhere, William," she said quietly. "I told you. I am where I am supposed to be." He reached out and took her hand, turning it over to look at the dirt on her fingers. Then he lifted it to his lips and pressed a kiss to the back of it, a gesture so formal and so tender that it stole her breath. "Then the East Tower room is yours," he said. "And anything else you want, you only have to ask." "I do not want anything else," she said. "I have everything I need." That night, for the first time, they sat together in front of the fire in his chambers. His chambers, though she had begun to think of them as theirs. He had a book open on his lap, but he was not reading it. She had a cup of tea in her hands, and she was not drinking it. The fire crackled and settled. The wind pressed against the windows. The bells of Thornwick rang for the evening prayers, and then fell silent. "William," she said. "I am glad I opened that door." He looked at her, and she saw the warmth in his eyes. The thing he had kept hidden from everyone for so long, and now let her see with Barrett. "So am I," he said. "I have been glad of it every day since." She set down her tea and leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, careful of his wound, and pulled her close. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Outside, the wind carried the first scent of spring through the windows. Wet earth, new leaves, the promise of things growing. Inside, the fire burned steady and low, and two people who had been alone for a very long time sat together in the quiet, and were not alone anymore. And somewhere deep in the castle, in a pocket of an old steward's coat, a ring of keys clinked softly, as if a door had finally been left open for good.
And so, the ice around the Alpha King's heart was finally melted not by a sword, but by the quiet courage of a kitchen maid. But tell me, my friends, if you were in Claire's shoes, would you have risked the king's wrath to open that forbidden door in the dead of night? Pull up a chair and share your thoughts by the fire in the comments below. If you loved tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, stay warm.